Okay, all right. So Brent, you're on the phone. That's terrific. Okay. I am going to share a screen and then we will get going. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. All right. I don't want to make it a slideshow. So can everyone see that main slide well enough? All right, that's what I'll do. All right. So thank you for coming tonight. We have not had a public discussion on the wire mill in a few years, and that is really due to us being in court for the last several years. Many of you know that we began a foreclosure in 2015, went through multiple phases, an appeal, and ultimately last summer, the Supreme Court ruled in our favor. And on February 16th, the town foreclosed on the wire mill property. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of the guest speakers I've asked to come, and I think you'll understand why as we get into this. So it's going to be a little bit different. It's not just me talking about the case itself. I wanted to give you context for a lot of the things moving forward, but also for about the wire mill and its place in Reading, because I know we have a lot of new residents who may not know the history of the wire mill and why it's so important and why we've worked so hard to number one, partner with a developer many years ago to help it move forward, and why we, aggressively took the action that we did so that the town could finally take control and again, begin to prepare it for a future development. So we have Brent Collias with us. Many of you may be familiar with Brent. He is our town historian. He also grew up in Reading, and he authors the History of Reading website, which many of you have probably come across. He's also the first selectman of Sharon. Sorry, Brent, I had to put that in. So we also have Sean Vroom here. Sean is the Director for Community Systems at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Their Technical Assistance to Brownfields program, NJIT tab. And I've taken some of their programs, incredibly helpful to me, and they bring a lot of expertise to the table, especially for small towns like us. Melissa Dolinsky is also here. She's a project manager at the TAB program. And I'm very pleased to also say that we have Dave Hurley with us this evening. Dave Hurley was the engineer of record on the remediation of the existing, of the wire mill site, and has a deep knowledge of what has been done, what needs to be done, and authored the remediation action plan that I refer to so often. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking, going through past history. I know that a lot of that will come up in the Q&A, and so I'm prepared to spend more time in Q&A. People aren't really fond of PowerPoint, and I want you to hear instead of read. So there's just, this is a photograph of the Weaving Building, which is really the iconic structure that you see when you drive past the building on Route 107. So this is the Norwalk River running alongside of the building south. All right, so brief history. Brent, would you like to pick up here? Rather than me go through these PowerPoints, I think it would be far more interesting if you would give us about a 10-minute history of the wire mill and how it fits into the history of our community.
Yeah, and I can consolidate that even more. And anyone who finds anything of interest can, we can basically build that out in the question and answer
and I can
period.
Stop sharing. Brent, can you hear us?
Yeah, basically, you're looking at a site that's historically significant from the time of not only first contact, but well before that. Obviously, you have the Norwalk River, and the Europeans that came here altered that quite a bit. But so we had native individuals here from a very long time period. Dating back to 10 to 12,000 years back. And so Riverside communities were a part of where we're at here with this current site. And then on top of that, you had the mill industry. So as the Europeans came into play, we made dams and we made power off of the river power. And from there, you saw other things come into play, like, obviously the first communities in our local region, which were Danbury and Norwalk, came into play in terms of transportation. So when Danbury was settled and decided to make roadways to the shore, which would be Norwalk or Westport, so anyone who travels Umpqua, you notice how it kind of weaves and makes its way up north. That's why. So that all ties to this site as a whole, and that's what I find attractive to it, is that it ties to the entire region of Fairfield County, but it also plays a role in the history of Connecticut as well. On top of that, basically, once we decided that industry was going to take place here, this company, Gilbert Bennett, plays a role in the story of American business from start to finish. So after the American Revolution and the war, the War of 1812, you had individuals that were looking to better their lives and the lives of their families, and they got ideas about how they could do that. And so this story basically tells that from the very beginning. So you're looking at a company and a location that ties into a history of innovation and American business from 1818, maybe even farther back than that, up until the current day, really. And that ties into a lot of different things, from innovation, the innovation revolution, woven wire. There wasn't woven wire until Gilbert Bennett. There wasn't insect screens or window screens as we know it until Gilbert Bennett. There was also a lot of different products that came out of woven wire that we don't really think about. And like I said, in the question and answer period, if you want to break that out, I can do that. Home business, cottage industries. I mean, that took place here in Georgetown, and Georgetown's just more than Georgetown. It's Weston, it's Wilton, it's Ridgefield, it's Reading. So, this was the heart of our community here, and this is what built out much of what we have in the present day. This wasn't just a mill story. This wasn't just a mill factory. This dates back to the very beginning of people coming here, and I think that's kind of what's neat about that. I mean, you have, basically patents. You have communication improvements in terms of the telegraph, transportation from just people traveling across roadways into railways, and then you have the Civil War that changes a lot of different things in how we operate as basically a country as a whole. Joint stock companies, which branched out of partnerships, and then that goes into basically product knowledge in terms of catalogs and entering into the new world, which would be the 1900s, innovations and globalization, and that's where this company is really neat. And there's a lot of stories to tell within it, and from, I guess, a standpoint of where I'm at, I mean, this is where my family came to America from. So 5 generations back is where my family came to Gilbert Bennett to create a new life. And it just wasn't that. I mean, from that point forward, this company allowed a lot of other immigrants, whether you were a Polish immigrant, a Swede, a Frenchman, an Englishman, you name it. They came to Georgetown to make a new life, and they made a new life that really improved not only their own, but our own. And so I think that's why I think, we now in the present day, with the opportunity that we have, we can tell that story, be proud about that story, and, think about in the present day how we make that story better So again, that's just a little bit of a taste of what was. This company truly tells the story of American business from the beginning to the current day. And I can definitely give you more as to what that history is. But for the most part, that's why I feel that this location is important and why it's relevant.
Okay. Brent, thank you very much. Okay, I'll go through some of the more mundane issues. Brent has really touched most of this. Just procedurally, the Gilbert and Bennett buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places. And Georgetown itself is part of a historic district, 144 buildings and sites. The factory, as well as homes, schools, and churches are included in this district. And of course, the Gilbert and Bennett factory is a brownfield and heavily regulated by the EPA and the Department of Environmental Protection. So there's a lot of history there. So again, briefly, in 1989, the Gilbert and Bennett factory ceases production. There was a lot of competition in the market that place. China had come into the market. So they were forced to close the Georgetown location. I believe they had a plant in North Carolina. 800 manufacturing jobs were lost. And the town lost a significant source of tax revenue, and the taxings began to accrue. So Reading currently has about 7% of its tax base is commercial property, Eversource being our largest single taxpayer. So when we talk about redevelopment of the mill, that's really, again, leaving a brownfield dormant has a real negative impact on the economic vitality of Reading. So in 1999, Gilbert and Bennett goes bankrupt, files for bankruptcy, and just shuts the doors. And so in 2000, the Board of Selectmen at the time, Natalie Ketchum was my predecessor, I believe Tina Miller and Jim Cotton, for those of you who've lived in town a long time, were the Board of Selectmen at the time. We convened a master plan committee. And that committee consisted of representation from the Board of Finance, the Board of Selectmen, the Planning, Conservation, and Zoning Commissions, all the land use boards. And they spent a lot of time, a few years, working as a group and with community members to develop a vision for what they thought would be the best approach forward to benefit Reading, and essentially a walkable downtown. If I were to read you the vision statement, and I have it, and I won't, it looks very much like our town's plans of conservation and develop dating from 1998 to 2008 to 2018 with minor changes. But there are still things in Reading that we don't have that we need, which we'll get into later. So vision in hand, the town selects, goes through a process of seeking a developer for the land, selects Georgetown Land Development to take on the property. And the mechanism for that is that Georgetown Land Development purchases the tax lien from the town that were about $1 million at that point. And I don't know if Pat Moisio's here, but it was essentially Pat Moisio, Natalie Ketchum, and again, other members of the Board of Finance and the Selectmen and all the land use commissions were involved in that. Because they purchased the tax liens, it didn't require a town vote. The developer of the town proceeded to collaborate, and I'm really jumping forward without details, collaborated in a week-long charrette that resulted in a master plan for a mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly, and environmentally responsible village center. Ultimately, it was a plan that was recognized nationally and received a Smart Growth Award from the EPA, which is a very competitive process. So some of these buildings remain and most likely be demolished. Most of the buildings that were slated for demolition have already been demolished. The question going forward is, are there other buildings that have decayed so much since 2008 that additional buildings will have to be demolished? So The redevelopment plan takes shape. The wire mill is a brownfield and it's contaminated by byproducts of that manufacturing. I'm sure Dave Hurley later on can really get into that. So virtually all the development activity on the site is regulated by the EPA and the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And they've been involved with this site back into the late 1980s, when Gilbert Bennett was required to start cleaning up some of the contaminated materials. So from late 1980s to the present time when the project stalled, remediation investigation has been ongoing. So a master plan was approved in 2004. Permits are issued and work begins, starting again with environmental assessments, and then going on through a number of these other activities. This building was one of the buildings that was intended to stay, and one that I fear may not be salvageable. It flanks the river, which you might be able to see in a different photograph. So the master plan that was approved in 2005 included 416 units of mixed housing. It was workforce housing, so affordable housing, senior housing, and apartment housing, townhomes for families starting out, or for seniors who were looking to downsize from the house and 2 acres, but still wanted to stay in town. Along with commercial, retail, and civic space. Among the entities that were anticipated as taking space in the development were the YMCA, and a black box theater was one of the civic programs that the developer had committed to putting in. We currently don't have anything like that, although I have some ideas. Access to the riverfront, so it's a walkable village. It is essentially Reading's downtown. That is the vision for the future. The development included a restoration of the Georgetown train station. Someone will have to give me the date, and Brent, you may know this, but it might have been the 50s, and the train station was removed, but the DOT committed to restoring the Georgetown train station. They'll pay for the construction of the platform. Of course, it's approved. It remains on the plan, but there's no funding for it. The developer would have built a 300-car parking garage. Georgetown is desperately in need of more parking to serve the existing businesses, and certainly it would be necessary for the development. Also a requirement, the existing wastewater treatment plant would have to be expanded to serve this. And that was a $10 million expansion. Unfortunately, the project again was stalled. And so both the master plan and the site plan for this expired in 2018. The property is subdivided into about 109 individual parcels. All right, so this is an aerial view of an architect's rendering of the master plan as it was approved. This is the pond that everyone drives around. Portland is here, the railroad tracks are here. So the town has foreclosed on everything north of 107, with the exception of this parking lot here. So this is North Main Street. So the entire historic core and around here, and there are a couple lots that are in Wilton that we don't have, but this is the major housing district. You can see some single family homes here, townhomes here. There are lofts over here. And I'm going to the Weaving building. So this is that big iconic building that you see here, which was perhaps going to be lofts or light industrial. So the other key thing you see here is the Norwalk River. And then I won't spend any more time on this plan. But this entire area was covered by warehouses, multiple warehouses and cement. So the river was not visible. It was covered by cement slab and warehouses. So one of the very expensive pieces that the former developer did was to daylight the river, because the river access is obviously vital to the community and to the development. So it's beautiful, and it has a gorgeous waterfall, which we'll see later. So can answer questions about later, but here's some renderings from the architect at the time that envisioned the pond. See the loft buildings and the apartments there. So, but how to finance that? So we had a developer who had to raise funding to build out what was estimated to be a $300 million development. So how to do that? The town of Reading certainly was not in a position to provide financing or tax credits of any kind to do this. Any borrowing that we would do on behalf of the developer was certainly very risky and would impact the ability to borrow and the potentially the bond rating of the town of Reading. And we would be responsible for paying back the debt in the event there was an issue. So, so a special taxing district is created by a special act of the legislature so that the developer could issue debt to fund the redevelopment. In 2006, they did issue bonds, 14.5 million roughly, and they borrowed 5 million from the USDA to fund the sewer plant. So the $5 million loan technically is a bond. The Treasury Department at the same time authorized $72 million in green bonds for the project. And thankfully those were not issued for reasons I won't get into, but it has to do with the structure of the taxing district and how that undermines the town in many ways, how it did. So millions of dollars in owner financing construction loans are sunk in the property for remediation and planning. Millions in federal and state funding over many years were awarded to the project for planning, mostly remediation and infrastructure. And in 2008, the financial crisis essentially stalls the project, shuts down access to the capital markets. The developer defaults on debt obligations, stopped paying taxes, sewer fees, and here we are. So we ultimately filed for foreclosure in 2015 with the developer owing, I believe, about $1.5 million in taxes and sewer fees. So this is a photograph of the post office on the site. When it was in perfect condition, it was, of course, on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Just some trivia. Again, here, between 2008 and 2013, the project is essentially, stalled. There were repeated attempts by the developer to bring in new investment, and they're not successful. And I think many of us didn't understand why that was. We would see the headlines. We were waiting. And despite interest from developers, a deal was never closed. So without a buyer and new financing, the project really is now regarded as a failure. But it's so important to the town. What are we going to do? More renderings. So in 2015, after a year of mediation, there's a new board of selectmen that is myself, Michael Thompson, Leon Carvelis at the time. And we've been in discussions, of course, with the Board of Finance and land use boards in 2015, after discussing with the bondholders, the developers, possible resolution that would allow new investment to come in and a development to go forward. None of those were successful. And so the town went ahead and filed for foreclosure. In 2017, the court rules in favor of the town. We go to the Supreme Court. And again, in 2020, we get the decision from the Supreme Court and we take title to the property. So what comes next? The town has long recognized that the development of the wire mill is of critical importance to our long-term welfare of the town. Oops, typo. The successful redevelopment will provide a broadened tax base, a variety of housing options, a walkable town, grand list growth, and more. Due to remaining issues with the bondholders at present, the property cannot be developed for taxable purposes currently. I mentioned the taxing district. It was the taxing district that issued the bonds. And our foreclosure extinguished tens of millions of dollars of debt but not the debt inside the taxing district, because a foreclosure does not extinguish bonded debt. So it's like peeling the onion one step at a time. So the town's interest now is in continuing to remediate the property to prepare ultimately for redevelopment. Before we foreclosed on the property, the town was accepted into Connecticut's municipal brownfield liability program. So we're protected from liability for the contamination that exists. We're not the cause of the contamination. And we're also protected on the federal side under, from CERCLA, where a municipality haven't taken title to this, quote unquote, involuntarily through foreclosure. So we're not exposed on the federal side either, which was likely one of the reasons the town back in 2001, 2002 decided not to take ownership at that time, because it was an option that the town considered. So what comes next? I thought at this point, it would be an excellent idea to introduce two other speakers who can talk about brownfield redevelopment and the challenges that we face now that we own this property. So we have Sean Vroom, as I said, and Melissa Dolinsky here from the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfield program. And they're going to talk to us about, developing a brownfield and what assistance they can provide to a town like ours. So without further ado, Sean, do you need to share your screen?
No, actually, Melissa's going to go first.
Okay. All right, perfect.
But first, thanks for the introduction. And good evening, everybody. Thank you. We're excited to be invited to this forum. As first Selectwoman, Pemberton State, my name is Sean Vroom. I'm the director of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities program, more commonly known as NJIT TAB. Again, joining me is my colleague, Melissa Dolinsky. She's a project manager with our program. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you kind of an overview of what NJIT TAB is and the types of services we provide. But before I do that, I'm going to have Melissa kind of give you a brownfields basics. Now, keep in mind that what she's going to present to you is an abridged version of typically what we do as a brownfields basics. Brownfields basics in and of itself is its own workshop, can go anywhere from 1 to 2 hours. We typically invite somebody in from the state brownfields program that we're working in at the time, as well as somebody from EPA's regional office. So, like I said, I'll go over what TAB is, what we do. But before that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, and she's going to give you a quick and dirty brownfields basics.
Sean, is there any way you, let me see. Oh, nope, I got it. I reset my preferences. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's so nice to see so many people interested in brownfields and wanting to learn about what's going on. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit, give you some very basics about what brownfields are, and then we can dive into a little bit more of the things that Julie was speaking about: assessment, investigation, liability, buzzwords like that. So very simply, a brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutants, or contaminants. So in the case of the mill, it's been very well documented that there's contamination, that there's been different processes that have led to that contamination at the site. So brownfields are basically commercial, industrial, real estate transactions with environmental components. We understand that brownfields can have just a intimidating look, and I've put some brownfields up here that just have an intimidating look about them. But brownfields are very diverse. We have different brownfields that, oops, sorry, skipped ahead. there's different brownfields in different communities that look very different. So there's gas stations, there's dry cleaners. There's also farmland. So something people don't usually think about a brownfields is farmland, but that can have pesticide contamination on it, and basically also be a contaminated property as well. So how many brownfields are out there? The EPA has put out a conservative estimate a few years ago that there are over 500,000 brownfields nationally. However, that number always grows, and it's likely that there are many unreported sites, even in your own community. So why do we do this? What's the benefits of brownfield redevelopment? Isn't it easier just to create redevelopment on things that aren't already developed or contaminated? But the redevelopment of brownfields can provide a lot of benefits to your community. Obviously, the environmental benefits of removing or treating contamination, but not just that, brownfields redevelopments produce 32 to 57% less air emissions per capita. Additionally, stormwater runoff is estimated to be 43 to 60% less when compared to conventional development due to the existing infrastructure on the site. The economic benefit of brownfields is important as well. So the vacant land can come back onto the tax roll. The redevelopment can attract different businesses, and those businesses can bring jobs that hire locally in your community. Next would be the safety benefit. So redevelopment of brownfields can eliminate these eyesores from a community, alleviate any fears and worries, and help the overall appearance of your community and reduce crime. And lastly is the social equity aspect. Eliminating and limiting exposure to contamination can benefit the health of your community. It can lead to a more diverse economic base that can bring needed land uses such as grocery stores, affordable housing, recreation, open spaces, and all the things that make a great neighborhood. However, as Julia obviously indicated before, none of this happens by accident. It takes a ton of planning, takes a ton of interest, takes a ton of people like you all on the line to really get into what you want this to be and how you want it to benefit your community. So before you dive into a brownfield, you really do need to do your due diligence, and you want to address any potential contamination in a timely manner. So the assessment and investigation pieces are the main differentiation between a brownfield and a conventional property acquisition. And this is where the environmental challenge comes into play. So community involvement are extremely important factors in the success. Engaging the community, forming those strategic partnerships early on will really help you understand what the community wants and what the community needs. And that's an integral part of the redevelopment process. So this figure basically displays the process in which a site is assessed and investigated within the federal regulations. The first step is the phase one. So the basis of the phase one is to determine if there are any environmental conditions on the site. The second is a phase two. This is where we determine if any contamination is existing on the site. And the third is a phase three, which would be more commonly called an investigation. And this is where we determine the extent of the contamination and where exactly that it's present. So with each step in the process, we come to learn more and more about the site, and we use this information to mitigate any risks that could be associated with a redevelopment. So we'll go into this just a little more. Not really terribly relevant to your site, but basically for phase one, you'll need to have permission to enter the property, and you'll identify recognized environmental conditions. So these things have already been done for the site. Basically, those are indicators of past pollutions or discharges that occurred. So during that process, we'll do a lot of historical records investigation, and we'll look at all the different past owners and things like that. However, we don't do any sampling during that process. The next step that we go to if we identify an environmental condition is to a phase 2. That's where we'll take environmental samples, we'll look at the soil, we'll look at the groundwater, we'll collect samples, bring them to a laboratory for analysis. They'll tell us the concentrations of different components, and then we'll compare those to the standards that are in play. So yeah, again, so all that sampling will be done for the environmental conditions that were assessed in the first step. And the last step, which is a phase 3, that's the full characterization of the site, a very detailed sampling that basically gives you all the information of what can be happening on that site. And it will really help you mitigate your risk. So yeah, so I have a conceptual site model here. It basically gives you the full picture of what can be going on at the site. There's all different ways that things can get into the soil, ways that things can get into the groundwater, into the air. So when we do this environmental assessment investigation, we look at all of these different pathways and we take a full picture of what is going on. So once the remediation is deemed complete by the professionals or the state, the redevelopment can proceed like another project. So basically you're coordinating with your state, local government agencies. And one important thing that people usually forget is to coordinate with all their local government and utility companies to make sure that they don't have any planned upgrades or capital improvements that might help them to have cost savings when they're redeveloping the property. So just to wrap up here, NJIT TAB has helped communities win approximately $12.5 million in EPA grant funding through our technical assistance program. And then at this time, I'll turn it over to Sean, and he'll tell you more and explain NJIT and the TAB and the assistance that we provide to communities like yours.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Let me see if I can. Okay, let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to quickly provide you an overview of NJIT TAB program. I'm going to explain how we can assist, or how we do assist communities that are pursuing brownfields cleanup and reuse. So since 2008, NJIT TAB NJIT has served as EPA's designated technical assistance provider for EPA Region 1. NJIT TAB serves as an independent resource to state, regional, county, tribal, and local governments, as well as nonprofits that are attempting to learn about, identify, assess, clean up, and redevelop brownfields. And the best part of this whole program is that our assistance is free. And the reason that all of the assistance and services we provide is free is because we have a cooperative agreement with US EPA, and they provide us with funds so that we can provide you with the services. So the NJIT TAB team is made up of a group of professionals. So we're planners, we're engineers, we're environmental scientists and social scientists, and we've provided assistance to hundreds of communities in the eastern portion of the United States, from Maine all the way down to Florida. Our assistance is available to communities throughout the entire brownfields redevelopment process. The NJIT TAB program is basically made up of 3 mechanisms. The first one is our resource center. The second is our educational and engagement forums. And the third is our one-on-one direct technical mentoring. So I'm going to briefly explain what each one of these is. So the first is our resource center. Our website is basically what comprises that. It contains a lot of valuable information. It includes a lot of resources such as federal and state funding sources, state and EPA contact information, previously recorded webinars and downloads of some of the workshops and seminars that we've conducted in the past. There's success stories up there. There's frequently asked questions. There's how-to videos on a bunch of topics. There's examples of successful EPA grant applications and much more. So I do recommend, if you're interested, take a look and peruse the site. We really did made some effort to make it as user-friendly as possible so that you can kind of go through it and get a good feel for what information is there, and it's easy to access. We also have a hotline as well as a dedicated and easy to remember email address, which you can see up on the slide. And we also provide valuable information via our social platforms, media platforms. So the second way that we provide assistance is through our educational and engagement forums. So we design and conduct workshops on brownfields and brownfield related topics such as EPA grant writing workshops, as well as the brownfields basics workshops, which would be an expanded version of what Melissa just covered. Our seminars are a little bit deeper dive into specific brownfield related issues such as environmental liability. We also do, half-day or full-day brownfield boot camps on topics such as green stormwater infrastructure in brownfields, as well as creative placemaking on brownfields. We do webinars. Those topics include, could be Brownfields Remediation 101, as well as how to get the right contractor on board. We also conduct all grantee meetings, so we coordinate with our EPA partners or regional offices, and what we'll do is get the grantees, whether they be new or existing, and we'll meet with all of them and we'll go over some, whatever pertinent topics that we need to cover at that specific meeting. And now with COVID restrictions, we've kind of been, we're restricted as far as in-person gatherings. So we've transformed some of those educational forums and workshops into virtual events, which has been very successful. We've been doing that since the lockdown, which is over a year ago. And lastly, the third way that we provide assistance, and this is really, our favorite part of this, is through one-on-one interactions. So, all along the brownfields redevelopment process, communities have questions, and they can either email us or call us with those questions, and we'll provide the answers. But sometimes, sometimes it may not be a quick answer to the question, and we recognize that every community's needs and challenges are different, and the type and the depth of our technical assistance, what we'll do is tailor it to your specific needs. So let me give you some examples of some of the one-on-one technical assistance that we can provide. We can help identify funding sources. We can review draft EPA grant applications and provide suggestions on how to strengthen them. And this is probably a good point for me to kind of clarify, just so you understand, with the assistance we provide, we're not going to act like your environmental consultant. We're in the business of building capacity at communities. So we won't write your grant application, but we'll critique it and help you make one that's more competitive. We're not going to go out in the field and analyze samples. We're not going to take those samples. But if you get a technical document from your consultant and they hand it to you and you're like, okay, I'm not really sure what this is saying, we can review it for you and put it into layman's terms. So like I said, we do the grant applications. We've done that for hundreds of communities throughout the New England region. And one other example of the assistance we could provide is if you have a number of brownfields and you're really not sure where to start, what we can do is develop a prioritization process for you. We'll develop criteria that reflects what your ultimate goals are, and then we'll take your brownfields and we'll put them through that prioritization process, and we'll help you identify what that low-hanging fruit and basically what your first, second, and third site that you should tackle should be. So again, those are just some of the examples. If you if you're not sure what assistance, or if a community isn't sure what assistance they need, we always recommend pick up the phone, give us a call. We'll have a conversation and we'll start to work through that. Just having that conversation, hearing what your goals are, what some of your issues and challenges are, we'll be able to plug in our expertise and the services that we can provide into helping you move your project forward.
Sean, thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll
That's
wrap up. There's my contact information, just in case anybody wants to.
great.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you. And something, I know I've participated in your webinars, but a lot of the heavy lifting in the next year and two are going to, our land use boards and commissions are really going to get deep into this. And so this is incredibly valuable for them to know. And also I know it's technical, but again, I think the residents of our community, the questions that I get a lot are, well, who are your experts? Who are you relying on? It's not just Julia Pemberton or Peg O'Donnell or Micah Thompson or any one of us doing this in a vacuum. But I'm picking up the phone and calling NGIT, or I'm calling DECD, Department of Economic Development. So thank you. And one of the important things also for people to understand is that these projects take a lot of money. And for municipality, finding those funding pockets is incredibly important. And I know that NJIT excels at that. So that's a relationship that we will definitely be maintaining. So thank you. So let me go back to my screen. All right. So what comes next? I'm hearing someone's speaker. So if you could mute yourself. I'm getting feedback. Thank you. Okay. So I want to just back up a little here. So we foreclosed on the property, and over the last 7 years, I have maintained a relationship with state officials who have in-depth knowledge of this project. I think many of you have been in meetings where I've invited members of the, officials from the Department of Environmental Protection. Before we foreclosed, they came to talk to the Board of Selectmen about the liability piece, because that's a big concern. So we've been very methodical accessing the resources so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. All right. So what are the immediate next steps for the town? What am I doing during my day? The first thing I'm doing is looking at, as what you saw on the screen, what the first step would be. Finding funding to do an environmental assessment of the property. As I said, this property has been assessed multiple times over years, going back to the 1980s and maybe even prior to that. But the EPA got involved in 2001 in doing remediation, cubic yards of sludge, and so I won't get into that. But the contaminants on this site are primarily heavy metals and some volatile organic compounds. But again, the EPA monitors the site regularly. But so much work has been done. For a community like ours, we need to have a new baseline from which to move forward. So it is a requirement for a private entity, before they purchase a site that might be a brownfield, to do an environmental assessment. Those are requirements. As a municipality, under these brownfield programs in the state of Connecticut, we are not subject to things like a Property Transfer Act. We have protection from liability. We are not, as a municipality, responsible for cleaning up the contamination that's there. A private company could be. So Georgetown Land Development was subject to cleanup requirements. They had to do the work. So we have to do an environmental assessment. I've just applied. In fact, the grant application went in yesterday for a I put in for $200,000 grant from the brownfields program at the Connecticut Department of Economic Development. And so we will keep our fingers crossed that we receive that grant. This is a really high profile project. Natalie Ketchum, our former first selectwoman, had been very successful in getting grant money for this from the state to assist. And oftentimes the grant money would come to the town and it would pass through to the developer. So our first step as a municipality is to do an environmental assessment. Then comes a planning phase, as Melissa and Sean talked about, the community engagement and the charrette. And then in the case of this property, had the developer not failed to continue, the next piece of infrastructure remediation they would have done would have been to address the river walls. And so I'm getting into the weeds. I'm going to stop there because you might learn a lot more about this through your own questions and answers. But about the environmental, I do have here one more individual that I would like to introduce to you. His name is Dave Hurley. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dave. Dave is a licensed environmental professional. He is a senior manager of the brownfield services with Langen Engineering and Environmental. He is working out of New Haven, and he has over 30 years of experience managing and directing these kinds of projects. So his focus has been on brownfield redevelopment, waterfront innovation centers, and so on and so forth. He's also a member of the Brownfield Working Group in the state of Connecticut. Again, very important. He's also involved in commercial real estate development. So Dave serves on the Ellington, Connecticut Economic Development Commission, and he was former chair of the Conservation Commission. So he checks all the boxes. He also has done, he was the lead engineer on the Gilbert and Bennett redevelopment project. So he has a deep knowledge of our site. There was a question came from somebody, when are we going to talk about our site? One of the questions I get all the time is it cleaned up? Is it a dirty site? Is it clean? And my answer is always no. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Dave, who can tell us a little bit more about the site itself and what we as a municipality, what we have to deal with first. So this is the first next step. With grant money, which we hope is about $200,000, to hire a licensed environmental professional and a planner to do the environmental assessment and also to look at the buildings themselves. So Dave, I think you are up. I don't know if you have a screen you'd like to share or whether you would like to address the group.
I think I'll just address the group, at
Okay.
least to start.
I'll stop my sharing then.
Okay,
So thank you for being with us.
certainly. Glad to be here. I've always felt very strongly about, this has been a project that I've been pretty passionate about. There were a lot of challenges to it and an ambitious development. But at the same time, the concept was a good, solid concept. It's one that will work there. I've talked to lots of other people who have looked at this site, or I've gotten calls, shall we say, at the office from other developers who have looked at the site, spoken to the town and so forth. And I ask them what they're going to do with the site. And I'm like, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. Things like putting a big box store over most of it and that kind of thing. And it's not going to work from an environmental point of view. It's not going to work from the town's perspective. It's not what the community is looking for. And so Julia asked me to give you a little sense of what's involved with these sites. So I'll start off with that. Having a contaminated site can make things very complicated in the development process. And you have to address the cleanup of the site, and there's also the liability associated with it. And so from a developer's point of view, those two things are something that frequently turn the project upside down from a market point of view, because they just can't, the real estate deal just can't afford the environmental cleanup, and the financiers or the developer themselves aren't tolerant for the liability, the potential liability. As a member of the Brownfield Working Group, we've recognized that these things take a long time and that those are hurdles that are very important. And so we've created in Connecticut some unique programs to address that. And the site's been entered into one of those programs, the Municipal Brownfield Program. It puts the site from a remediation and liability perspective on hold. The town has the property, but they're not liable for the previous contamination. They do not have to clean it up. They have to have a path forward, a vision to move the project forward and see it redeveloped, and outline that to the state. But other than that, it puts it in a position where the town can get monies from the state and from EPA as a municipal entity. And many of these, much of that funding, certainly in the form of a grant from either age and at either level, a developer is not in a position to get those. And so the municipality, while they're in the municipal brownfield program, can go ahead and do cleanup to address issues that will make the site more marketable and to bring in development partners. Now, the thing is, you've heard about grants and you've heard about assessments and studies and so forth. These all take time. You apply for grants and then it takes a while to get them. For instance, EPA's process, you apply, they announce it in September, you apply in November or December, they make an award in May, and then the money's actually available the following October. So if you have to go for numerous different sources of these kinds of funds, this all takes time. And that, and studying the site, assessing the site, doing the investigations to determine what needs to be remediated takes time. Now, one of the things do have going for this with this site is that a lot of investigation has been done. Over 350 soil borings have been drilled on the site. I don't know how many of them are still remaining, but over 40 groundwater monitoring wells were installed and over 70 sediment samples. So the site characterization has been done to the satisfaction of the regulators that the remedial action plan was approved by DEP. The thing is now is that going forward, you need to get a handle on what are those conditions now, have they changed, summarize them for you so that you know, not for the previous developer's benefit, but for your benefit, what are you working with? What do you have for environmental conditions on the property? Have there been activities out there that have changed so that the conditions may have changed? You know, did people start piling soil in certain places that now may change the conditions? And so that is part of what would be done in a phase one process. So the phase one that Julia was speaking about is done in accordance. EPA has a rule as part of the Brownfields Act of 2000, I think it was 3, all appropriate inquiry, which is provides another layer of liability protection, and for buyers in those cases. But it also has been adopted by the ASTM, which sets our standards in the industry. And so you do a phase one in accordance with those standards to identify what we call recognized environmental conditions, and in addition, in Connecticut, areas of environmental concern. And then that process involves interviewing people who have special knowledge of the site, or we're actually conducting operations and so forth on the site, doing a historic file review, of which the file is huge, at EPA, DEEP, the town records and so forth, and going over the site, looking for visual signs of contamination and so forth, and then summarizing all that in a report. So that's the phase one. Now, the next step in that process normally is a phase two, and in Connecticut, a phase three. And then you get to the completion of the phase three, you've characterized the site in accordance with, as the state says, prevailing guidelines and prevailing standards. That process has been done for the most part. So further investigations that need to be done for this site really are more related to your plans for future development or infrastructure. And so it will affect your construction costs and so forth. And you want to do things to minimize, and there's a lot of opportunities on this site to minimize your construction costs. So I say construction, remediation construction costs. So the further investigation I envision after you've done a phase one is going to be very specific to certain target areas that you need to gather more information because of what you plan on doing in those areas. There will need to be a new remedial action plan because the remediation action plan is usually referred to as a RAP. The RAP is very specific in terms of integrating the development with the remediation. So the one that was previously approved had a specific development that was going to be on top of it. That development had certain barriers and liners in place so that the soils with the contamination there would not be exposure pathways for humans, or there would be the prevention of, for instance, those base metals leaching into the groundwater and then into the river. So that's a summary of the process. And you have to be patient with this process because it is an iterative process, both from the environmental perspective, but also from the development perspective, in terms of finding the right partners, having the right plans, and coming up with a development plan that everyone is comfortable with, and then going through the process of financing the development.
Yeah. Dave, I have a question. When we spoke earlier, we talked about the river walls.
Yes.
So we do the phase one. Roughly how long does that, would we say that process takes? Is that a year? Is that 2 years?
The phase one?
Yeah.
Well, normally for a small commercial piece of property, it's less than a month.
Right. 44 acres.
So for this, it'll be more involved, but you know, you'd count it in weeks or months, you know,
Okay.
it's not going to take a year or anything like that.
Okay. All right. So that's good to know. So we talked about the river walls. And I do understand all the challenges, you know, the master plan is expired. It likely doesn't, it will have to change due to
Yes,
market conditions and the different, you know, what does the town see as the best use of the property for the town?
Right.
That results in the planning process, but the river walls are really urgent because of not only the height issues, the contamination issues. In your, you know, I know this, you're not doing this work now, but would the river walls be something that would have to wait until you have a new plan for the entire thing? Or is it possible that we could, and the reason I ask that is because as I explained to you earlier, seeking funding to do the river walls is a priority. We have two pieces to do on this property before a shovel could get put in the ground. So if the developer had continued on his path, the state had approved $5.6 million for the river walls
Right.
in one intersection. Now that was in accordance with the old plan, but the weaving building is still there on one side and the One North Main Street building is still there. So that channel won't change very much. So, and clearly those river walls, I mean, they were bad in 2008. So I know it's not, I won't hold you to this, but is that something that would have to wait until you do a full new planning exercise?
No,
Okay.
no, I don't think so. The river is there. It's, you know, it's not up to you to move it, you know.
Right. Right.
You
Right.
know, there are things that can be done to enhance the sustainability
Right.
of the project by doing the Riverwall project.
Yeah.
And so it's an important, you know, if the Riverwall goes,
It's a
it's
disaster.
not the same site.
No, it's a disaster. It's an environmental disaster, really.
Exactly. Yes, it's an environmental disaster, and it will change many things. So
So that's a question.
if it needs to be replaced or enhanced, you know, replaced and enhanced, that's a good priority.
Okay.
That's a very, very good first priority. You know, it's also an important priority from a redevelopment perspective, but it's more than that. It's a important priority for the environment.
And I think another piece when you say for redevelopment, if the property is ultimately to be redeveloped by a private developer in partnership with the town, well, we've got things to deal with before that, like the bondholders. But at present, the property is not saleable in that a developer will have to put so much money into the ground before they can begin to build housing that will be profitable. You know, they'd have to come in and they would immediately have to do the assessments, the river walls and intersection, the river
And
walls
roads.
and roads. So they have to bring in the water, you know, so they're looking at $20 million, maybe.
Maybe more.
Maybe more before they can begin to construct housing. So a developer is going to look at this. It's going to be an incredible challenge, but there are opportunities for a municipality to continue to move this forward and to deal with some of the other challenges. We can work on what we can do, the remediation, engaging a planning firm to do that community engagement piece. I hate to use the word charrette. That Melissa talked about. And so all of those things really important. So for everyone who's listening, those are that's what's going on now. Those are the priorities that we're addressing one step at a time in a very methodical way. So I think with that, it's probably time for some, Q&A. I know people wanted to talk specifically about our site, but I think your questions will inform, again, the information that you receive. So, as I could talk forever, as many of you know. So Dave, thank you very much. And I hope you'll stay, because I'm sure there'll be questions that are addressed to you and Sean and Brent, if you're still there too. I hope so. So I'm going to try and see everybody here in a gallery view. It's going to be challenging. But if you have questions, if you could raise the hand icon, and I will do my best to see you. Okay. I don't see your name. It says owner, but I see your hand. So yes. You need to unmute. Oops, you almost had it. There you go. Oops, it keeps going.
Okay, yes.
Perfect. All right, you're here.
My name is not owner. It's
I know it's not. It just says.
Sidney Goldman. I live at Meadow Ridge. Okay, you dropped a number before, $300 million. What does that encompass? In other words, if I wanted to develop all the things you're talking about, 416 apartments and 375,000 commercial property, it's got to cost more than $300 million, right? So what is that 300 million?
Right. That's a really good question. And I can't answer that, because those were numbers that were floated back in the, 2005, 2006. So obviously
at that time, was it a complete number?
That I can tell you that
Dave was working on the project at that time. So thank you, Dave, for.
Yeah, it was, the number was more like 350 to 380. And it was complete as the master plan was approved. I don't know if it included things like the river edge and I don't think it included the train station.
Right, yeah, wouldn't have.
And I don't think it included the garage.
Right.
But it did include the housing and the office space, and construction costs were different then than they are now.
So you might be talking today $1 billion, right? Considering the elapsed time and all these other aspects, that you're talking about $1 billion. I would think.
Well, I would also add that at the time, if all that was built out financially, it would work. In other words, the market was there to support, and then the costs between the costs and the market, now things were pretty hot in that at that time. Until the crash, things were hot, in 2005, 2006. So the economics of it worked. It worked well enough for the developer to have to get approved for a construction loan by the Bank of America. The failure of that loan, delivery of that loan, is really what what caused the fact that in the end of 2007, the banks were already actually in trouble. They knew they were in trouble.
Yeah. And you couldn't get financing at that point. So,
yeah.
Right. And I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Lehman Brothers who was going to the issuing bank. And I see Frank Taylor's on the line too, you may know.
Frank may know more than I do.
Right,
yeah.
for the green bonds, and we know what happened to Lehman Brothers. So at any rate, so that's great. Does that answer your question, sir?
Does, and I was joking a few months ago when the Powerball jackpot was $1.5 billion, and I said I'd like to buy that whole property there. And you know, but it sounds to me like had I won, I could not have completed the project.
Well, as I said, we'll have that community engagement activity. That will, again, for instance, many of you may know that, and I know Dave Petit is here, that Branchville had done a transit-oriented development study. It cost upwards of $250,000. The planning firm Fitzgerald Halliday was engaged. It was federal funding that came through our Western Connecticut Council of Governments to do that study. But that's an example of the kind of community engagement process that we will do again for the Wire Mill site. So, and we have the old plan is an excellent guideline, because while I hear, well, we don't want to do that again. If you look at what the vision plan was, as I said, many of those elements that Reading recognized it needed back then, we still need now. Different kinds of housing, some commercial, but it's the scale of it. And again, the market, what is the market for things like commercial real estate? We don't know. I'm sure, COVID is going to change a lot of things. We just don't know yet. So,
well, for example, a lot of the townhomes that were looking out at the river, the waterfall and so forth, those in concept were live work space.
Yep.
But it was envisioned that it would be professionals or artists who would have their townhome upstairs and their business door at the street level.
right.
And back then it seemed that seemed so progressive, so changing, out front. And now with COVID, gee, it seems like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it really does. When you see artists, there's, gosh, which building is it in Bridgeport? Is it a fabric art building or something like this? So, you take a look at the Weaving building and you think what a marvelous space that would be for artists, an incubator space. Because, often artists come in first, and oftentimes, good things follow. So,
well, and for your community, I could see an investment banker who wants to spend 3 days out of the week in Connecticut, not in Manhattan, in an office. But he has to be set up with all the technology. He's got to have a office space and so forth, or an accountant, So you could have a real range of different professions that operate like that.
Yeah. And so that's a really good point. We have a significant number of Reading residents who were telecommuting before COVID. And again, one of the thoughts was, I don't like to use WeWork as a model, because that's been, I think many people have read about what a failure, the IPO and the CEO, but either way, that is still a very, those facilities are terrific, and there might be an application there. So, all right, other questions? And I'm gonna raised hands. I also want to add, because I mentioned art, that we have tenants at the Wire Mill, and for many years, Weir Farm has been a tenant. So we have the National Park Service with a significant footprint at the Wire Mill. And again, in many conversations with the superintendent, incredibly helpful, informative. So again, that's potentially another path for, advice in terms of where to find these pots of money as a municipality to help advance what we need to do in terms of the planning and remediation. And so I'll just leave that there. I'm looking for other hands. And I'm not, Nancy Peltz Paget, yes.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much. This is really terrific. I have one just quick question on the study evaluation front. I'm not sure I heard whether the Weaving building or the buildings are part of that evaluation. I heard you talk about or the folks from New Jersey and elsewhere talked about the banks of the river and so forth. Is
Right.
the analysis of the buildings part of that same analysis, or is that a separate deal?
Right. Dave, would you like to address that? Because that question was raised earlier, and I know that the buildings have, VOCs in them. But is that, again, civil engineering? So, or is that something that the LEP performs?
It's actually, the LEP license is, we act on the behalf of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Right.
When it comes to hazardous building materials,
Mhm.
such as asbestos,
Mhm.
that is by folks who are licensed by the Department of Health.
Okay.
So we refer to them as hazmat, or HBM, actually, hazardous building material
Right.
folks. And
Right.
that's a different kind of protection, or different kind of qualifications and so forth, although there's a lot of similarities. Early in my career, I used to do quite a bit of that. But that that can still be funded under the same grants.
Right, right. And so Dave and Nancy, so again, a lot of that assessment has been done. And as I was saying before, demolition has been done. Tremendous amount of demolition and asbestos remediation. All those warehouses that were in the back of the property that you now see slab on, or the Nissan cars that are parked there. And again, I know that Frank has knowledge of that as well, and he's here. I can maybe answer some of these questions, but those warehouses had asbestos, among other things, but there is still asbestos. Frank was showing me the basement of the 1 North Main Street building, pointed out the pipes and other areas where certainly asbestos remains. So those would also be in the records though, Dave, would they not?
They should be, yes.
It would be. Okay. So
Yeah.
so in a phase 1 assessment, are you pulling that information in, or?
No.
No. Okay. So that's the hazmat team. Okay. All right.
Well, I don't want to say hazmat team, because that's a whole nother
Okay.
HBM team.
HBM team. Okay.
Yeah.
Hazardous building materials. All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Julia, there are some people who are asking questions in the chat who aren't.
I know. Okay, so I'll get to that. I'm going to do with the hands that I can see really quickly. Gerald Rooney.
Hi, good evening. I have what I think is a fairly basic question, but I'll sort of express it in the form of a statement. So if I understand correctly, the overall plan, the town would really have fairly limited financial outlay and exposure. If I understand correctly, grants would cover most of the first phases. And then when we would get to a final development, it would be up to the developer basically to find the financing. Is that, I know that's an extreme simplification, but
Right.
Is that a relatively accurate set of statements?
It is relatively accurate. And even private developers are looking for things like federal tax credits, state tax credits. They come to municipalities and ask for tax credits in the form of, a TIF district where and actually the prior developer had an approved TIF, but the conditions again weren't met, whereby the town would forego the incremental tax revenue on the commercial property for a period of years, 7 to 10 years. So those are the sorts of things that municipalities do to assist developers, to incentivize that development. So yes, that's what NJIT calls a funding stack. And yes, the private market is part of that. And we saw with Georgetown Land Development using the taxing district to issue private debt, mortgages, private debt coming to Reading for a TIF for tax abatements. So, so your question is extremely relevant. But yes, the town is going for grant money initially, and so yes. Mr. Scott.
Yes, hello, thank you, Julia. I'm hope it's okay. I'm a neighbor. I feel like I'm eavesdropping. I'm from Weston, but I love the site. I feel like I've been watching it for 20 something years. So the question is involvement of the other towns, because it's technically Georgetown's a census designated place, which doesn't mean all that much. I don't know that you're obliged to work with other towns, but do you plan, especially Wilton, I would say, but Weston has a little corner of Georgetown.
Yes,
Will you
do.
engage the other towns in the process?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I have a message into Lynn Vanderslice in Wilton because of the intersection. So, you know, until most recently, you know, I don't want to jinx anything. So Lynn and I have sort of had this, you know, the knowledge of what's there, but the in-depth conversations about that intersection work. So when I said to Dave, you know, the $5.6 million for the river walls, the immediate next infrastructure piece is the intersection that leads out into Wilton. So yes, so it's Weston, Wilton, Branchville, and Reading. So yes, the answer is yes. So,
great, thank you.
You're welcome. Howard Sherman.
Hi, Julia, and thank you. This has been super informative, and thanks to all the guests. I've got two questions, Julia, one for you and one perhaps for Sean and you. The first question relates to the bondholder situation. And as briefly as maybe possible, I know it's a complicated situation, but could you give the group a sense of the implications of having those bondholders, as well as our potential strategies for getting through that? As I understand it, that's one of the challenges. So that's question one.
Right.
And then Sean and Julia, maybe together, clearly there's an awful lot of sequencing of events that are critical to the success of this project. I guess my question as it relates to that is, and Sean may have a broader perspective from other projects in the region, is it typical to sequence all of these various steps, or to parallel path? And if there's even a dart thrown at a range of time, Sean, for a project of this magnitude and complexity, you know, what would be a reasonable range of time for understanding what the development timeframe might be? So those are my two questions.
Okay. Sean, do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll take the second one. You know, that's a really difficult question.
Yeah.
Trying to put a timeline. You know, a lot of it's going to depend on, you know, what grant monies you acquire. You know, I know that there's an application in now for assessment monies. If basically it's decided that you want to go after federal EPA monies, brownfields monies, that's going to be a fall solicitation. That whole process to get your money in hand takes 1 year. So it's, you know, you put your application, you know, they solicit for applications, you put your application in, you know, you get your award notification in the following spring, you put together a work program, and then you actually get the money in hand about fall again. So it's a 1 year process. So how, you know, what grant you win, how much, you know, there's various EPA brownfield grants that you can apply for. Each one of them handles a different phases of the work. There's assessment grants, there's cleanup grants, there's multi-purpose grants where you can do assessment and cleanup. So I would not knowing that detailed about the project and where things are at as far as what gets won, I wouldn't even want to kind of guess. You know, putting funding stacks together in and of itself can take a couple years just to figure out what you're going to, you know, how you're going to finance this. There's a lot of other federal funding sources outside of EPA that may be brought to bear. There's USDA. There's you can, you know, HUD monies. You can look at US EDA. There's US DOT that may be applicable here. You have a rail line. There may be some transportation monies available. Those vary from year to year. So, you know, I really would want to venture a guess. It'll take a little bit of time, but I mean, these projects in general do but keep in mind that, you know, developers, that's really is going to be the key, I think, is to attract, get a developer that's interested in this site, because developers don't look at these as brownfield sites. They look at them as real estate projects with an environmental twist. So if you get somebody and you get a good developer in that has that mindset, you know, he can move things along. But I really, I'd be remiss if I tried to pitch, you know, or throw out an estimate.
Right.
But they take a little bit of time, but more than your average real estate project, no doubt. But
Sure.
it could take a little while.
Like
But
a
I don't want to
decade.
discourage you and say, oh, you know, you're not going to see anything for 20 years. That's not, you know,
Right.
as long as you get moving. I mean, I think the key for you is to get the planning together, you know, do your vision planning, you know, any plans that need updating to reflect, you know, what these new goals are going to be is critical. That's going to be critical for you if you decide to go for federal dollars, because EPA and all those federal entities are now putting great emphasis on the planning that goes into a project, because they see their monies as seed money, and they want, you know, to feel as comfortable as they possibly can that this is going to come to fruition and be successful.
Mhm.
Julia, may I just ask Sean a quick follow-up
Of course.
on that answer, which raises one other thought / question, which is, when you think about organizing the funding stack, I mean, you just spent a few moments, Sean, going through, you know, the various potential options, right, for the early funding stack, which my understanding is you guys are a resource to Julia and the town to assist us in reviewing our submissions for those potential funds through grants, but not necessarily a resource to identify which resources or to complete those grants. So is there, you know, is there a grant for that resource
Well, they
to expedite, you know, our resources and our ability to kind of identify what those potential sources are?
We can
Yeah,
assist
they
with that,
do
but
that,
what's
Howard.
critical, we can help you identify what potential funding sources are out there. But what makes that, you know, what's important for us to be able to do that is that we have what that vision is, so that we can identify what some of these elements are. So if this is, you know, if this is a TOD district, if that rail line is going to be reactivated, that may trigger the applicability of US DOT dollars. So if that's not an element of your project, then obviously US DOT monies wouldn't be applicable. And those programs kind of vary from year to year, and they also vary in what application you can use the funding for. Some allow for demolition, others don't. Some allow for demolition only if it provides you the ability to assess a section of a site. So there's a lot of variables. So, but what we need at least that base to know, what are we looking at? You know, what are the elements of a project?
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you so
But
much.
we can certainly help identify what those sources would be, those funding sources.
If I could chime in from a developer perspective, and I've talked to numerous developers about this site since 2007. But just in general, when you're dealing with something like this, it's key for the developer to understand what the development is that you want. What a brownfield developer, you know, and I would say this is the kind of site where you need to get a seasoned brownfield developer, but someone who's dealt with these kinds of sites, they need to know what you're expecting. So, because they don't want to build something that the community is in opposition with. They want to work, it's a public-private partnership to do this. And so they need to know what it is you're looking for. And they can tell you whether, you know, financially that's not going to work. You need more density, or you need more parking, or whatever it is. But you have to have a vision so that they know whether that vision is realistic, and if it is, then to start looking at it and doing their own due diligence as far as how does the real estate work within those parameters. So again, that planning is again critical, and you have enough assessment data from an environmental point of view. We can tell you what your limitations on development are based on the environmental conditions, which that typically takes years and multiple grants. So you're already past that. And so you really, it's important that you know what you want.
Yeah. And then, throw in that it is a historic site. So we've got that historic core that, it makes this not just another development. I mean, we don't want, a Trumbull Executive Park or, and I shouldn't say Trumbull, that's not negative, but love Trumbull, all the doctors are there, but that's not what I believe we want in our downtown. That's why we have these historic structures. So that adds another component. And again, in the funding stack, Sean, that's, the federal historic tax credit programs.
And if you look at EPA's brownfield grant applications, they give preference to applications that are reusing structures on the site.
Right.
So, I mean, that's at least, they modify the guidelines from year to year. They don't drastically change them, but every year there's usually a little bit, there's a different focus area on what they want. Is it near a water body? Is it, does it reuse structures on the site? So that's why you have to, if you have all this together, we could help you kind of forge that path and things you want to consider as you're moving forward that will make you, those are competitive programs, the EPA brownfield program. We can help push you in the direction to make your application more competitive.
And back in the day, this was a very high profile project. And it checks all the boxes really where it is. TOD, DOT, historic properties, historic district. And again, as Brent was saying, just a tremendous amount of history. So, but Howard, you were asking for a time frame, and Frank Taylor, if you want to chime in too. I remember from the beginning when they talked, from the time that Steve Solar began this project to the time when all of the prospectuses said that they, anticipated, full, occupancy was from, I don't know, 2002 to 2012 or 13. Frank, is that accurate? I'm seeing the head nodding. Yes. Frank, do you want to add in there? Frank was the chairman of zoning for 30 years and was chairman when the master plan was approved.
Yeah, the development timeline was at least 10 years.
Okay.
It really depended upon, Solar was going to act as a general contractor to find people to actually do the development portions. So part of it was his time to find somebody to build the apartment building, build the townhouses. So he was pretty straightforward, saying it's at least a 10-year development project.
Yeah. So, all right, thank you. So Howard, does that answer the question? I know we didn't get into the bond holder.
Yep, no, that was super helpful for the perspective. And it does sound a little bit like there's some chicken and egg here in the sense of, having some rough out of a vision in order to understand what the financial resources might be. So doing a little bit of both at the same time, it sounds like. And yes, the bond issue is of a lot of interest, I think.
So the bond issue, and that relates to the special taxing district. So I'll try to be, again, 10,000 feet. So we have special taxing districts in Reading. All of our volunteer fire departments are examples of special taxing districts. Usually a special taxing district is created by the residents of the district who are, again, levied an additional tax for a service, whether it's like a community association where you pay money to maintain the pool and the tennis courts, or that's what you pay taxes to our fire district separately than your taxes to the town. And the fire districts, special taxing district has the municipal powers, the power to tax and to issue debt. So in this case, Georgetown Land Development was the only resident of, the only resident within this taxing district that they wanted to create. And the statute says you need at least 15 residents of the district to create a special taxing district. So what ultimately ended up happening was that the state legislature by special act created the Georgetown Special Taxing District. So you had a taxing district with taxing authority sort of sitting inside Reading. So I had done, like, if anybody remembers Tim Russert, when Tim Russert on MSNBC used to have his whiteboard and he would explain everything. So when I first started talking about this, after doing my own research to understand it, I had a big whiteboard with Venn diagrams. It was kind of complicated, but anyway, so the taxing district sits in the town of Reading. Reading taxes all the property, all the small lots, 109 of them, in the taxing district. The taxing district then levies its taxes on its own property, right? Well, it has one owner at the time, GLDC. So where the taxing district comes in is they needed to raise money to fund the development. I know there were discussions, just based on review of the notes, of, what was the capacity of the town to assist in funding the development. And, I don't have firsthand knowledge of that, so I don't want to get into it, but ultimately that didn't happen. And so the taxing district was created, the district issued debt. I think it was the 2006 issuance of those $14.45 million GO bond, which is a 30-year bond that ends up at $18.85 million. So that sits in the district, and bonds are not extinguished by a foreclosure. So the bonds still sit in the district, Howard. However, the town established itself the lien priority bit, and I didn't get into that, but that's really what led to the foreclosure, that we pushed that process forward. When we began learning about the project and digging into the reasons why it really stalled, I think people didn't really understand why nothing ever happened, why a developer could never close the deal. I think there were, Frank, remind me, 14 some creditors, banks, even the Bank of Kuwait still had a note. I think Steve Solar bought the note of the Bank of Kuwait, but either way, there were mortgages, there were mechanics liens, all of the engineers that, all the individuals who put, sweat and tears into that project were creditors. So with the special taxing district language, unless it says otherwise, the special taxing district and the town were assumed to be on equal terms. So in that sense, the town was not ahead. So if you don't pay your mortgage, your bank can foreclose. But often what happens is that the bank will pay your taxes, because the first person in that priority is the town. So if the property owner doesn't pay the taxes, the town can foreclose on the property. But oftentimes the bank will step in and pay the taxes for a period of time until they take the property. So either the town takes the property or the bank does. But in this case, the special taxing district was saying that they were equal with the town. And I thought to myself, and this was where the research came in, what municipality in their right mind would give up their lien priority to a taxing district with one owner who had the ability to tax themselves? And that's what they did. So they issued the debt, $14.5 million, and they lay a tax on all of the individual lots that they own, to, on paper, have a budget of revenue and expenditure, the debt service on the bonds that met out. So let's say it's a $1.9 million they owe the bondholders in principal and interest. They would tax the property, the balance and all their expenses. But of course, the developer doesn't pay his own taxes, so that creates a lien. So you've got this mess in the district of debt and tax liens, and they're saying that they're equal with the town. So if the district has $20 million of debt in it and the town has 3 and we're equal, and this is what was happening. the town's leverage is here and all of the creditors are here. So what we would hear is, well, you should just sort of walk away, let us move this forward. And at the end of the day, you'll see some money coming back, but just waive your lien priority. The answer is no. And so the research that we did uncovered a public act that amended the special act. So in order for the district to issue those $72 million in green bonds, the special act had to be amended. There was some issue with the town of Reading's their debt limit. So there was some language put in, and in that public act, the lien priority language was different. The lien priority language said that the special taxing district is ahead of all others, blah, 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 except for the town of Reading. So our entire case hung on the one word except. Does except mean you're equal in lien priority, or that the town of Reading is ahead? And I'm being this open about it because the case is decided and the town won that. So our foreclosure wipes out all of the tax liens in the district. It wipes, unfortunately, out all of the junior creditors, the individuals who did work on the project. But we're stuck with those bonds. The town of Reading is not obligated to pay the bonds. We're not responsible for them, but they don't go away. So, the challenge for us is either to, again, figure out a way around them. And I'm not going to get into strategy because that's a whole nother legal issue. There were attempts to mediate with the bondholders, which were really unreasonable. And I'm not going to throw out the numbers. First, they wanted par, then they came down to 60 cents on the dollar, which was also ridiculous. It was $19 million. We countered with 2, and both parties, it was, you want 19, we'll give you 2. And we said, see you in court. So Howard, that's where we are. I would expect at some point those discussions would continue, but again, the town is not obligated to pay that debt. And unless the property is transferred to a developer and becomes taxable, we don't have to pay that. And there are ways for communities to pursue housing without creating a taxable development, ways that we can enhance what the community has to offer. And again, and still provide revenue in other ways. I think in one of Sean's, in one of the presentations I was listening, many of these brownfields along a river, they create an environment that attracts businesses around it. So not necessarily in the district, but if you have public housing, when I say public housing, look at Westport, look at Fairfield, they have housing authorities. If you have a public housing authority, now I'm not recommending that for Reading, although a redevelopment authority was considered back in the early 2000s. There were 3 approaches that this visioning committee, the master plan committee, contemplated. One was taking ownership outright, the way we just have. The other was to create a redevelopment authority. And then the third was to partner with a developer, a private, public-private partnership, and they went down that road. So again, there are many options, and I don't want to, again, get into it much further because there are so many people here on the line, and I guarantee you there's someone who has an affiliation with a bondholder. There's usually someone there. So at any rate, I think I'll leave it there, Howard, but we can always talk offline. And what I will say, if anybody has questions that are more detailed, feel free to contact me. We can have those conversations.
Okay, thank you, Julia.
You're welcome. I'm going to go to the chat because I know that there are a lot of questions there. So I'm just going to go down the line and see. Jim Balger, you asked a question about the president's infrastructure initiative. Would there be any funding there? There's so much that we don't know about that. And of course, that has to get through Congress. But that's about infrastructure and transportation. And as we know in Connecticut, our transportation system is woefully inadequate. There's a plan on the table and has been for years to improve our rail lines. There's a study to, again, improve the Danbury line. That's where the train station for Georgetown sits, but there's no funding for it. So to the extent that we have more federal funding, you know, adding service to the Danbury line, bringing in a train station, again, that's all economic development. So, you know, we can hope. Okay, so I see a question from Chris Hesketh Tutton. Where are we on phase 1? Has it been started? So the answer to that is that the grant application is in. So the phase 1 starts when we have the funding to hire that LEP, that firm, and a project manager to do that. So the grant application is in for that. The other thing that I will say is that earmarks are back. So I have a deadline tomorrow to put in for an earmark. And again, so I think the congressman gets 10 projects. And as you can imagine, it's, you just never know because they're looking for really high profile projects. So this is where we're looking for the funding stack that can help us get not just from phase 1, but also to the remediation of those river walls. And at the same time, I keep talking to DECD, the Department of Economic Development, and they, as I said, I've kept in touch with them for the last 7 years. They were the first individuals I met with when I had the RAP that Dave Hurley authored, and I said, please explain this to me. We were sitting in the building in Georgetown. I said, I need to know what's under these slabs. I want to know where this stuff is, so that I have that own knowledge that that I've learned it myself. So we're looking for the funding, Chris, and so that's where we are. And so we also do not have a new vision for the property. That will come as part of that community engagement. But I will say, as before, that vision statement from long ago is not inconsistent with what a vision statement would be today. I think if we all had a charrette in the community center, if I said, do we need affordable housing? I don't think people would say no. Do we need housing for seniors? I'm pretty sure people wouldn't say no. Do we need recreational space? Do we want a river that we can walk along and have picnics along? I'm pretty sure people would say yes. So I think a lot of that vision is applicable to now, but I think the mix has to change. So that's the answer to, that's my answer, but I'm one person, and that's why we bring in the planning firm to do that community engagement piece. So, okay. So I'm going to keep going down. What is the status of Ridgefield's request to use the Georgetown sewer plant? Okay. The status of that is that they currently do not have access to our sewer plant, and I will tell you why. I've said from the start that I think what's good for Branchville and that TOD is good for Reading, because we put money into those businesses, right? So we are their clients. However, that sewer was paid for by the $10 million and quit claim to the town. Without that sewer capacity, our property cannot be developed to its full potential. In which case, we're not growing our grand list. If we give our sewer to Ridgefield, we're growing their grand list. And my position is that Reading comes first, that if through our visioning plan as a community, what we envision doesn't require the level of sewer, and we have members of the Water Pollution Control Commission here, Dave Petit, we may have you dig into this, because Dave also attended those Branchville TO meetings as I did. We can't tie our hands, but let's say the vision for that site is less intensive. Maybe we do have extra sewer. Here's the other thing though. The sewer that we have is permitted to a certain level. In reading a lot of the documentation, there is build out capacity. So Ridgefield could technically finance another phase of this treatment plant for their own use. But we can't, again, so I guess long story short, we can't give away our sewer until we know what our plan is. Dave, is there anything you want to add to that? Or have I got it covered? All right, we'll move on. Okay. I see. Yes, yes to artist space.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Dave, yeah, okay.
I'd just like to add that, our physical space that we currently occupy with the wastewater treatment plant is limited. We don't have a lot of additional room to do an expansion at that site.
Okay.
I still think that Ridgefield, if they're real serious about needing sewer capacity, ought to consider approaching DEEP to get permission to build their own smaller treatment plant than they currently have in the center of town,
Yeah,
somewhere along the Norwalk River,
right,
and utilize that.
right. I think the issue for them is obviously an issue of money and having to pump the water uphill, I think.
Well, but if they were to design something to be placed in Branchville,
Right, it'd be different, so.
it
Waiting
would be
for it
different.
possibly pull on me, but no.
Okay, all right. So thank you. I will keep going down the line and I see someone who's talking yes to artist space. Yes, absolutely. And as you hear what Dave was saying, the original plan had artist lofts, live workspace. So we're a very artist-friendly community. So what type of community involvement do you need? We're interested in helping. We will need community involvement. And as I said, so, at the very outset, there was the, visioning committee that was land use centric. And we would need to expand that group, bringing community members. But I do think that process needs to be guided by a professional planning firm. Because if we do it ad hoc, I think we've all been parts of, involved in committees that become so large, they're not productive. So open to suggestion. I just want to be sure that when people get involved, they're not disappointed we don't spin our wheels. So I think we need professional expertise to guide us in that planning process. But reach out to me. I'm open to ideas. I would love to talk to you further. Here's a question. What are the key immediate funding needs? The key need is the $200,000 that I have put in the grant for. That would allow us to hire, to start that phase 1 investigation, basically. And so I believe, Dave, if I'm not mistaken, the original phase 1 was in the range of $150,000 for the phase 1. That was done maybe in 2002 with Steve Solar. So.
Well, that wasn't a phase 1. That was our first phase of investigations.
So, okay. So what is the sort of order of magnitude for the investigation, the full phase 1? In just sort of ballpark, can you give us some sense of what that looks like?
Probably in the $5,000 to $15,000 range.
Okay, that's tiny. All right. Okay. And the individual, the deputy director at the.
And I excuse me, I shouldn't have said 5 to 15 because for this site, it's going to be, it's going to be more, but
that's why I said
10 to 25,000 or something.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then maybe the old paperwork I was seeing involved much more the sampling, the phase 2, and going all the way through. Phase 1.
And it doesn't involve any sampling.
And this won't involve sampling. Okay. So it's much less expensive. And the team that I was speaking with who recommended that this was a grant, because there were a number of brownfield grants to apply for. There was an assessment and remediation grant, and I was advised to apply for the assessment only grant. And so then again, we move on to the next grant. But so it's the initial $200,000, and there's some latitude, so we could use some of that funding, I believe, to hire a planning firm to begin that community conversation. which is really,
That's correct. You can hire that funding, eligible funding on that includes survey, legal,
Yep.
acquisition.
Mr. Charles is talking now.
so,
He's not happy. He's rolling his eyes now.
okay. I'm here. Oh, well, someone's rolling their eyes. I'm sorry, but if you could turn your
But
microphone off.
it can be used
No.
for, it can be used for a wide variety of things in terms of brownfields.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Is this John Board? I see something from John. I don't have my hand raised. What is the ultimate goal here? Is it to resurrect the original plan or develop a different one? So that's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for the community to be involved with. As I've said, I think that the old plan is a baseline. It was a good plan at the time. And I think, Dave has worked on that and Frank was on a chair of zoning when it was approved. We shouldn't be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but we should look at that as a baseline from which to look at and adjust and amend, because a lot of work and a lot of money went into that. So we shouldn't be starting from scratch. We should be looking at and saying, what do we want to keep and what needs to go? It's a good base. Call it a skeleton to go on. Okay. From Terry, was there FEMA flood zone change since the beginning of the GLDC? Dave could probably answer that. My belief is yes, the flood zones changed, and I think the flood maps are going to change again. But the Weaving building, Terry, is in the 100-year flood plain. And that is why the river walls have to be raised. The river walls raised will take the Weaving building out of the 100-year floodplain, which has to be done before redevelopment can begin. And as everyone knows, the 1955 flood was deadly, wiped out the entire factory. If you read the history, it was just absolutely devastating, and they had to rebuild. So, and someone was saying, it doesn't mean you only get a flood once every 100 years, but so Terry, I don't have the full knowledge of that, but I believe the answer is yes. But it hasn't it's not in our favor. So it's not in our favor. Has this been recorded? Yes, absolutely. This is recorded. We'll make the link available on the town website. Does the town expect that grants will cover all of the environmental remediation? No. I think that's an unknown right now. So for instance, the next piece of remediation would have been to do the river walls. The state had approved a $5.6 million grant for that. The bond commission approved it. So would I think that we could access $5.6 million? I've already asked for it. So to the extent that we can get funding as a municipality to fix those river walls, that's a grant. That's a significant piece of remediation that I hope that we can get the funding for. It's in the best interest of the state to help get that done, because if there is a flood and as we said, the contaminants get into the Norwalk River, that's an environmental disaster. They're going to have to come up and clean anyway. That's water supply. It goes right down to the Long Island Sound as well. So can negotiations with the bondholders which have failed to produce a settlement satisfactory be terminated immediately? I do not understand why. Okay, I'm trying to understand this. Which have failed. So we're presently not negotiating with the bondholders, Terry. So I guess I don't really understand your question. It seems like it's contradicting itself. I do not understand why this presentation makes it sound like this is not possible. I think what you're saying is, why do we have to deal with the bondholders at all? And again, I don't want to get into the legal aspects of it. We've talked about putting the taxing district into bankruptcy. So there's been a lot of research done, Terry, on potential avenues for that, but because it's legal, I'm not going to go any further with that. But suffice it to say, the town under, as long as I'm here, has no intention of paying the bondholders. Okay, so I know that that's a concern that you've had over time. So Marianne, yes, thank you. Becca, it's being recorded. Chris, who is defining what we want and when do we get a view? Right. When we've engaged the planning company, so if we get the grant money, we'll be hiring a planning firm to do that public engagement. When we looked at just the example of Branchville, federal funding was used to engage a planning firm, Fitzgerald Halliday, to perform that transit-oriented development study. I was funded by federal money because it was a TOD study. So when do you get a view? Everybody has a say, and that's in the planning process. But at present, I have to keep moving the ball forward. And as the first selectwoman, I've got to sign the dotted line on those grant applications. So right now, from a technical standpoint, I'm moving paper around. So I do that. And I do that in consultation with the boards and commissions. I don't make those decisions in a vacuum, nor do I decide what happens at Gilbert and Bennett. That's a community discussion. I thought we had established that. Okay. Can I talk about the amount of affordable housing allocated in the redevelopment? Is there a level that is federally required? So my understanding, and Frank, you may know this better, I believe there were 50 units of affordable housing in the original development. I think that's about the number. So as we know now, there's a widely recognized that we have significant gaps in opportunities for diverse housing, that we have an affordability gap. So that's where, again, the state is very focused on creating a diversity of housing options. What we also know economically is that within Connecticut, the communities that had a diversity of housing options recovered much more quickly from the last recession in terms of home values than communities who were on 2 acres with single family homes. So it is in the best interest of the town of Reading economically to have a variety of housing, and also to provide opportunities for our teachers and our firefighters and our senior citizens to be able to live in this community, which is not affordable for the average person at all. So the other thing, as far as affordable housing is concerned, that's another piece of the funding stack. There's money available if you build affordable housing. So that's a discussion to continue to have. So, but again, that's part of that community conversation. If we're going to get funding from the state, again, there will be strings attached for affordable housing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also a good reason for the town to be in control of a lot of those conversations, because there are a lot of housing bills floating around there, in addition to 830G, which means a developer can essentially override your zoning regulations and build, let's say 400 apartments and put in a few affordable housing units, but really that's just a token. What they're really after is the for-profit units, and they throw in the affordable simply to get around your zoning. So that's not the approach. The approach really is to build affordable housing that puts us closer to that 10% requirement. Okay. Okay, Claudia, given the revisiting of the master plan and the importance for this to coincide with the environmental, how will this come together, timing, and will it be shared with an opportunity for input? Absolutely. So the hiring of the firm and the environmental piece can happen together, because as Dave, we talked about, you have to know what you want to build before you can plan the remediation, because that matters. If you're going to build a parking garage that's 2 levels that goes underground, and you have contaminants there, that means you have to pull that out of the ground. Well, you're spending a lot more money on remediation than if you could do service level parking. So the answer to that is absolutely. Comment on the potential opportunities with the adaptive reuse of the Bible church. Oh boy, okay. I've made no secret of my interest in the town acquiring the Bible church. I know some individuals think, oh, it's called the church, but it really should be the Gilbert and Bennett Center. It is a beautiful church. It is the center of the downtown. And while we are waiting for Gilbert and Bennett to be realized, that provides us a tremendous opportunity to have a facility that draws people in from our surrounding communities for art, music, theater, for reading space, activity space. It is a marvelous facility. The congregants would like the town to have it. We have not had it appraised. And we're in budget season and focused on this, but I believe that's of tremendous importance to the town. I know that business groups down in Georgetown are very supportive of this, and I continue to meet with various groups in town to talk about that. And so we're building a lot of support for that. I've asked the owners in the past, I've introduced them to private interests and said, do you have any objections to what the building might be used for? And I know pubs are a non-starter. It is a church. It is a sacred space. It's also the case that the organ, so it's in a National Historic District. It is a recognized building. The organ is also historic. I won't get into that because that's the weeds, but we could use the church tomorrow for a concert. I've had the building inspector in there. And again, that building is usable in its present form for community activities. And I'm sure if we wanted to hold a concert there to bring the community in to just experience it, that we could convince them to allow us to do that. Again, I had hoped that we could watch, that we could introduce this whole process with a viewing of a Georgetown story, but COVID really prevents us from doing that. So yeah, I really feel strongly about the church and the value it brings people into Georgetown to patronize our businesses while we are waiting on everything else. Okay. Who's getting the revenue from the parking lot space that Eversource is leasing, and how long are they going to be there? Okay, so the revenue from the parking in front of the building is going to the former owners of the site. We don't own that piece. They paid the taxes on that piece, so we were not able to foreclose that piece. They own it, and quite frankly, it's got a really big hotspot of contamination under it. So, so for now, that's fine. That's actually not a negative for us. We don't need that piece, so they get the revenue from that parking space area. However, the town has utility tenants in the actual mill site, which we do own. And so the revenue from those tenants can be used to offset the carrying costs of the site, such as insurance, so that is not a burden to the town. And as I mentioned, so we have the National Park Service is a tenant. We could have anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000 in rent, depending on, who the tenants are and whether they stay or not. But we currently have a utility company there. We have a landscaping company there. And we agreed for the time being to honor the existing leases and to keep those tenants because we do need the revenue to help maintain the property. So I love this question. Any plans to enhance the curb appeal of the site in the short term? I understand where you're coming from. I have the highway department down to look at fixing the wire fencing that surrounds the edge of Portland that is an eyesore. So yes, yes. Thinking about improving the curb appeal, absolutely. Sheltering the view, the green tarps, perhaps, we've talked about putting them on the inside of the fence because the wind seems to blow out. So, but really staying on top of how that all looks. So yes, yes. Okay, what's happening in Georgetown with the building renovations and leases available, restaurant where Washington Prime is going to actually open. So we do have the old saloon building is occupied. It has its first tenant. She lives in Reading, and I believe she is a candle maker, among other things. So I hope that's a business that you'll patronize. So it has its first tenant. I don't have any news on the old building that had Washington Prime in it, but it is a local owner. And I believe there's some interest, was interest, but COVID really put a damper on that. Okay. We don't own the church. That is owned by parishioners. That's correct. Can we expect at least some demolition of broken windowed mill we pass each day in the neighborhood this summer? Maybe. One of the things that we had talked about several years ago, there was a study done of the condition of the buildings. And so we would, yes, like to enclose the buildings, keep the water out, and that would include addressing the broken windows. But I can't give you a time frame for that. It's a historic building. How we repair those windows might have some bearing on any grant funding. So that's something to look into. So I can't answer that right now, except to say, yes, I'd like to see those windows fixed, but it's not to take them out and leave the holes open for the weather to get in. We would need to seal the space, including any holes in the roof. So I see there's an interest in leading the effort to have concerts using the organ. Wonderful, thank you. We'll be in touch. So yes. Okay, so that's all the questions I see in the chat. I know there are other hands raised, so I'm just going to scroll through. Let's see. Nancy, your hand is raised again. Is that a new question? Or is your hand just still there?
No.
Okay, okay. And I see an M. Hudson. Is that a?
At this point, we're just prolonging his pain and his family's.
Miss Hudson, is that a?
Yeah, it's you answered my question already. Thank you.
Okay, okay, all right. I don't see any other questions. So this is recorded, and I have a habit of posting my personal number on Facebook. So if anyone has a pen and they want to write it down, I'll give you my phone number. My number in the office, for anyone who wants it, is 203-938-2002. And my cell phone, I have two. Let me give both of them. Actually, this one is good. So I'll give you my personal one now. The work phone is dead. 203-856-1801 is my cell phone. Text message is the fastest way to reach me. I get 500 emails a day. And so it takes me a long time to wade through them, and I don't want to have anyone waiting a long time. I really hate for that to happen, and I know it does. So call me, text me, email me, and I look forward to talking with you all again. So stay in touch. And I want to thank you, Sean and Melissa and Dave and Brent, really for adding so much to this conversation and for all your questions. And Frank Taylor, you too, and Dave Petit, really all played a significant role in this project and bring a lot of really valuable knowledge to it as we go forward. So thanks all.